I think we can all agree from South Carolina's side of things that Drake Maye is a really good quarterback. But I also think that the Gamecocks defense can prove on Saturday night that Drake Maye isn't unstoppable.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and you can find my written work over on Gamecocks Digest on SI.com. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team every day. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more right now. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are just 4 days away from South Carolina's Week 1 matchup against the North Carolina Tar Heels taking place in Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte, North Carolina. And as I talked about on our Monday show, there's a bunch of storylines to pay attention to and follow heading into this highly anticipated and nationally televised contest. But obviously, one of the bigger ones and one of the easier ones surrounds the quarterbacks in this matchup, Spencer Rattler and Drake Maye. And on today's show, I want to talk about Drake Maye a little bit because I think that every South Carolina fan, even if you don't like to admit it, you'll concede that Drake Maye is a really good quarterback. But there is a way in which the Gamecocks defense could slow down and even stop Drake Maye on Saturday night. Now, with Drake Maye, there's not one particular thing that you can do to completely stonewall him for an entire 60 minutes. With a guy like Drake Maye, there's a couple of different things that you've got to do. In essence, there's a formula that you have got to put together on the field in order to defeat Drake Maye and this Tar Heel offense. So we're going to break that down step by step right here on Locked On Gamecocks. The first step to stopping Drake Maye, and this has nothing to do with Drake Maye himself, you have to keep the run game in check. When you face a star quarterback like Drake Maye, who is athletic and can throw the ball with both accuracy and touch, the last thing that you want to do is make the game easier for him. When you allow a quarterback to get in a bunch of 2nd and 5 situations, or 2nd and 4s, 3rd and 2 situations, so on and so forth, you allow the opposing team to control the flow of the game. And with North Carolina, who likes to run the air raid offense, the air raid offense is, in a way, about slicing and dicing a defense up through 1,000 paper cuts, essentially, using routes like spacing routes, drag routes, and hitch routes, routes that all are about only 5 to 6 yards deep down the field to try and get 4, 5, 6 yards at a time. The Gamecocks have got to win on first down against North Carolina's ground game so that Drake Maye has got to convert in more 2nd and long and 3rd and long passing situations on Saturday night. The next part of this formula to stop Drake Maye involves South Carolina's pass rush. The Gamecocks have got to get pressure, in my opinion, on the interior of the line of scrimmage, and second-level defenders and also edge defenders, when able, have got to take good pursuit angles when they go after Drake Maye. Drake Maye is no Lamar Jackson. This is not a guy that can take a run 60, 70, 80 yards to the house against an SEC-level defense like South Carolina's. But his field awareness combined with his footwork and his adequate speed does make him a dangerous threat, scrambling out of the pocket and even at times being used on some designed quarterback run plays. There is a way, however, to negate Drake Maye's legs, besides, of course, getting sacks in the backfield. And that way, in my opinion, is to get pressure on the interior. Because if there's one weakness in terms of Drake Maye's overall athletic profile, it's that he doesn't necessarily have the quickest get off when he is moving laterally or horizontally on the football field. So, if Tonka Hemingway, Alex Boogie Huntley, TJ Sanders, and Nick Barrett, if those four guys can win their battles up front, or the defensive ends can condense the pocket through maybe some stunts and twists that are dialed up by defensive coordinator Clayton White, then that will flush Drake Maye out to the side, out laterally, but it's not going to be moving directly down the field like he would be if he was able to step up in the pocket and just run through the middle of the line. That's why getting pressure on the interior is so important in this game. And if the Gamecocks are able to do that, it's going to give their edge defenders and also linebackers a chance to chase down Drake Maye and either tackle him or force him to make a good off-schedule throw, which Drake Maye can do in the short passing game. But if Drake Maye has got to throw a pass on the run, and the pass has got to go, I would say, 15, 20 plus yards down the field, there's no guarantee that the pass is going to be spot on for his wide receiver. That's the case with most quarterbacks, but it also is the case for even a really good quarterback like Drake Maye. So get pressure on the interior, flush him out of the pocket, and make him have to beat you laterally on the field. And the last thing that South Carolina could do to stymie Drake Maye on Saturday night is attack the ball when Drake Maye takes off running down the field. Now, when I compiled the notes for today's show, I watched some of the game footage from last season's Duke and NC State games for North Carolina. And in the Duke game, I picked up on something pretty interesting. When Drake Maye takes off running down the field, unless he's corrected it this offseason, he runs with his arm at a 90-degree angle, unless he sees a defender coming right at him, and then he will tuck the ball up a little bit higher and bring his wrist up so the ball's a little bit closer to his body. Now, why exactly does that matter? Well, when you hold a football with your arm at a 90-degree angle and up against essentially the side of your abdomen, the thing about holding the football in that position is it's a compromising spot because there's essentially two different openings in which a defender can punch the football out. And so if Drake Maye takes off running at any point during Saturday night's game, and a defender from maybe say his right side is running right at him, Drake Maye does not see him, that defender may have a chance to punch that ball out of Drake Maye's arm, force a fumble, and in essence create a turnover opportunity for South Carolina's defense. So, to sum everything up, there is a formula that you can use to stop Drake Maye on the football field. And that is keep the running game in check, get pressure on this man at the interior of the offensive line so that he has to be flushed out laterally, take proper pursuit angles so you don't let him just scramble on past you, and when you get the chance, attack the ball when he is running down the field. Drake Maye, again, is certainly a talented quarterback. No denying that. He is going to very likely be a first-round draft pick this next April. But that doesn't mean that Drake Maye is perfect. It does not mean that he's invincible. And it does not mean, in my opinion, I'm sure the opinion of all of you, that he can carry North Carolina on his back against a team like South Carolina, who, quite frankly, is not getting enough credit for some of the guys that they still do have on this football team. They can go toe-to-toe with a guy like Drake Maye. And not just slow him down, but stop him as well. Now, before I was even able to get to some of Drake Maye's game footage from the 2022 season on Monday, there was a big-time drop that came from South Carolina's football program. And that drop that I'm referring to was their first week depth chart. And so, in just a couple moments, we are going to discuss some of the main takeaways from this depth chart, some of the big-time position battles that are still taking place in the trenches, and also a lot of freshmen and young guys overall being listed in that 2 deep ball across both the offense and defense. We'll dive into all of that in just a little bit right here on Locked On Gamecocks. This show is brought to you by BetterHelp. According to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, depression is one of the most prevalent mental health conditions in the U.S., and it is the leading cause of disability worldwide. In 2020, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, around 39% of adults with major depressive episodes did not receive treatment. There's a lot of people out there that are struggling every day, and a lot of those people are struggling internally, and they're not showing maybe all the telltale signs of possible anxiety or depression. And so if you're in that situation, and if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your own work or school schedule, you name it. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnCollege today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnCollege. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. As always, thank you to each and every one of you every day for making us your first watch or listen here today. On our Wednesday show, we're going to go over North Carolina's offense and defense, and more specifically, how South Carolina could exploit both of the schemes that North Carolina runs on each side of the ball. We'll touch on all of that in more detail on our Wednesday show right here on Locked On Gamecocks. But let's go back to Monday afternoon, around lunchtime, when South Carolina released their Week 1 depth chart for the North Carolina game. And there was a lot of takeaways to be had with this depth chart release. So we're going to start off with some of the competition that seems to be still ongoing in the trenches. Because in all honesty, I don't think it's all bad. In fact, I think the majority of it is a good sign. Let's start off with the offensive line. At the offensive tackle positions, Sidney Fugard and Jackson Hughes were both paired up with an or at one offensive tackle spot. I would assume probably the left tackle spot. Kason Henry and Tyshawn Wanamaker were both listed at the other tackle spot, likely the right tackle position. Sidney Fugard has definitely bounced around a little bit throughout fall camp to this point. Jackson Hughes literally came back, I believe, just ahead of the first fall camp scrimmage that South Carolina had a few weekends ago. Same deal with Kason Henry. And Tyshawn Wanamaker is a guy that's been in the program for several years now. But again, he has just always seemingly struggled to find consistency at that right tackle position. I said, I think a couple weekends ago, that I thought Kason Henry was the guy to beat at right tackle. I felt like he would be the guy that would maybe start in Week 1. And while it's not a guarantee based on this depth chart, I would have to imagine that he very well could be the guy. And Sidney Fugard, same deal with him. People talk about his pass protection, how quick he is getting into his kick block in pass pro. I would say that if that's the case, considering the fact that he went through spring ball with South Carolina, reshaped his body a little bit to get ready for SEC ball, I'd probably say that he is the likely guy between him and Jackson Hughes that could start at left tackle. And I think the competition here is good for these offensive tackles. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that's still ongoing. Now, granted, would Shane Beamer-Dowell-Loggins probably like for these positions to be finalized at this point? Yeah, sure, because now it's game week. And now instead of taking all of your time to prep for your opponent, you're taking up some time in terms of the individual offensive line unit to still figure out who your stars are going to be, at least it seems like, at both tackle spots. Now, moving to the interior, it seems like that is pretty much set. Vershawn Lee is going to be the starting center. Nick Gargiulo is going to be starting one of the guard spots. And Ja'Kai Moore is listed as the starter at the other guard spot. The only move that might be a touch surprising is Ja'Kai Moore being at one of the guard spots, considering the fact that he brought the most Power 5 experience at that left tackle position. But in my opinion, I think that it is partly a good thing that Ja'Kai Moore's been moved inside. One, because some of his best games of his career have taken place at left guard, specifically the last 3 games of the 2022 season. He had an average pass blocking grade of 80 according to Pro Football Focus. Pretty good based on their grading scale. And also, I think that it is a indication of confidence, a display of confidence in Sidney Fugard and Jackson Hughes, that those two guys can handle their own at that left tackle spot against Power 5 and SEC level competition. So that's the offensive line unit. Now let's move on to the defensive line group. The interior defensive line is essentially set. Taka Hemingway and Alex Boogie Huntley are the 2 starters at defensive tackle. No surprise there. And TJ Sanders and Nick Barrett, they're the backups right behind them. Once again, no surprise with that pairing. I've mentioned this before. I'll say it again real quickly. I love this group. I love the depth. I love the versatility. I love the athleticism. It's probably one of my favorite groups on this entire football team. I think this group is set to have a really solid year under new defensive tackles coach Travian Robertson. Now, the edge position, much like the offensive tackle position, that's the position group that seems to be a bit undecided or unclear in terms of who's going to start. Jordan Strachan, Brian Thomas Jr., and Desmond Umeozulu are all listed at the specialized edge rusher position for South Carolina. Some might be a bit surprised that Jordan Strachan is not listed as the outright starter here, based on what we've all heard coming out of camp and based on what I've been able to see at fall camp. Jordan Strachan's been moving on really well coming off of that torn ACL injury that he suffered in 2022 against Arkansas. But I don't think him being listed alongside Brian Thomas Jr. and Desmond Umeozulu is because of what Jordan Strachan is maybe doing wrong at practice. I think it's because Brian Thomas Jr. is making a legitimate push. We've talked about him several times on this show. We talked about some of the reports that have come out that he has been a standout during fall camp. Clay White named him as a guy to watch as a possible breakout player at USC's Media Day event. He absolutely dominated in South Carolina's spring game. And Brian Thomas Jr., almost most importantly, compared to everything else I just said, he has put on some weight and is ready to likely be an every down type of edge rusher for South Carolina. And Desmond Umeozulu, he's probably the most talented freshman edge rusher that South Carolina has brought into the program in several years, probably since Kingsley J.J. Enagbare joined the fold, or I guess technically Jordan Birch, you could probably say, in that 2020 class as well. But my point here with this position group is, I don't think there's a bunch of oars listed here because of Jordan Strachan. I think that there's a bunch of oars listed here because of Brian Thomas Jr. and apparently Desmond Umeozulu and what they have done so far in fall camp. Now, at the other defensive end position, there's Tyreek Johnson, Jatius Gear, and Terrell Dawkins, and they are all listed side by side as sort of co-starters at that position. Now, a lot of good things have been said about Tyreek Johnson, his progress in the weight room in the offseason, and what Jatius Gear has done in fall camp. How he has put on some size in order to get ready for SEC play himself. I am a bit surprised, admittedly, that Terrell Dawkins is listed alongside both of these guys because, quite frankly, Terrell Dawkins, he's been staying hurt. He got hurt a lot last season. I think he was even dinged up a little bit in spring ball, and he's been dealing with injuries again in fall camp. And I feel for Terrell Dawkins because I think there's true potential there. But you've got to be available in order to be able to make an impact for this team. So you might be able to spin this as a good sign that Terrell Dawkins is listed alongside these other two guys. But quite frankly, I think that this position does come down to Tyreek Johnson, Jatius Gear, and it might be just who's the most healthy heading into this week 1 matchup against North Carolina. So a lot of competition still going on both the offensive and defensive line. But again, I don't think that we should all read too deep into this and be overly concerned about any of these spots. I think for the most part, South Carolina is just fine. They just want to take a little more time to figure out who the guys are going to be at each of those positions. Now, we'll be sure to talk about a couple of other takeaways about the depth chart that was released on Monday afternoon in just a few moments. Before we touch on that, Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel is the official betting partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Let's continue with a couple more takeaways from this depth chart that was released yesterday afternoon. One of the ones that I haven't talked about yet, Antwane Wells. He was listed as a starter at wide receiver, and the best part, there's no "or" listed alongside his name. And so, if there was still even a morsel of doubt remaining, and I will not act like I didn't have my own doubts in the middle of this past week, that is all completely left the building with this depth chart being released. Now, this does not mean that Juice Wells will be playing at 100% on Saturday. In my personal opinion, I still feel like that Juice Wells is basically going to be available, and he's going to play. But I just don't feel like we're going to get the Antwane Juice Wells that we saw at the end of last season. But the fact that he is still going to be able to play is a big deal for South Carolina's offense. Also, a side note, Trey Knox, who also has been dealing with an injury in fall camp, he is also listed as a starter with no "or" listed next to his name at tight end. So it looks like that two of the biggest offensive weapons in South Carolina's passing game will be good to go for the North Carolina game in 4 days. Another takeaway that I had from this depth chart is that there is a youth movement that is taking place in the 2 deep. The first or second year players on this roster that were listed as starters on Monday were offensive tackle Kason Henry, possibly, along with potential edge rusher starter Desmond Maye. Linebacker Stone Blanton also was listed as a starter, and nickel corner Keenan Nelson Jr. was listed as the starter at that spot ahead of veteran defensive back David Spalding. I think this is really notable here. Nothing against David Spalding, because again, apparently he's also been dealing with a little bit of the injury bug again in fall camp. You really do hate that for him, because Spalding has certainly flashed in some games here at South Carolina. But Keenan Nelson Jr., it seems like that he's been building up for this moment for a very long while now. Think about this. Last season, in the regular season, Keenan Nelson Jr., he hardly played at all in the secondary for South Carolina. Then, of course, the Gator Bowl comes. Cam Smith declares for the NFL draft, opts out. Darius Rush had been dealing with some injuries, was ready to begin training. He opted out. So the Gamecocks needed some guys to step up. Keenan Nelson Jr. stepped up at nickel and started there, and O'Donnell Fortune started at the other outside corner spot opposite of Marcel Style. And now, both of those guys are listed as the starters at both of those spots heading into week 1 in 2023. So it just goes to show just how much hard work will pay off for you during the off season. Kudos to Keenan Nelson Jr. because it really does seem like that Gator Bowl, it gave him a confidence boost, and you'll be amazed at what that can do for a young player in a program like South Carolina. So Keenan Nelson Jr., again, just props to him for taking that spot seemingly over David Spalding, at least for the time being. Now, some other first or second year players that were listed in the 2 deep but were listed as backups. Wide receiver Nicholas Harper. He was indeed listed as one of the backup receivers for South Carolina. So he is going to be a part of that 6 wide receiver rotation that Shane Beamer has talked about multiple times over the past couple months. Offensive lineman Marquis Anderson was listed as a backup at one of the guard spots, I think specifically behind Nick Gargiulo. He was the only true freshman out of the guys that got brought in this offseason that made the 2 deep heading into week 1, which is not a total shock because I think it was also the only guy that actually got to campus before spring ball took place. So Mark Anderson being listed there, not a total surprise either. Center Grayson Maines, redshirt freshman, listed as a backup at that center spot. Pup Howard, one of the backups at the linebacker position. In the secondary, there's a ton of moving pieces in terms of young guys in this 2 deep. At cornerback, true freshman Judge Collier and redshirt freshman Emory Floyd are both listed as the backup outside corners. That says a lot in my opinion about Judge Collier, a guy that I have to admit, again, did not get as much fanfare as some of these other guys in his class, and even relatively compared to some of these other guys in the 2022 class that came before him. But he has grabbed one of the backup spots at that cornerback position. And you've also got safety Jalen Kilgore, who is listed as a backup in this Clayton White defense as well. A couple of other quick notable takeaways. Juju McDowell is running back number 2 on the depth chart behind Takarion Joyner. I do not believe, though, that means that Mario Anderson Jr. and Dontavius Braswell won't get snaps. I think all 4 of those guys are going to get some snaps, especially at the beginning of the season as this staff tries to figure out what all they've got at that position. King Dominion Ford, what a week he has had. He got the Jake Panis walk-on scholarship this past weekend. He was surprised during a walkthrough practice, I believe, essentially on Friday. Whole video got posted by South Carolina's football account and everything on social media. And just a great story, honestly. Dominion Ford, he's not been talked about a whole lot the past couple of years while he's been with this program, but there's reason to talk about him now. He is officially in the 2 deep at that strong safety position right behind sophomore Nick Emenworry. Omega Blake and Eddie Lewis were listed as the other 2 backup wide receivers alongside Nicholas Harper. So again, that is the rotation of 6 guys right there when you include also starters Juice Wells, Amarian Brown, and Xavier Legette. Speaking of Xavier Legette, he is going to be South Carolina's kick returner in 2023, and the punt returner for South Carolina is going to be Amarian Brown. I've got my own opinion on having starters playing those returners' positions. I feel like that's a spot where you could get a younger guy back there if they can handle it, but Pete Lembo is the best special teams coach in the country, so I'm not going to question any decisions that he makes, honestly, because he has more than earned that right. So those are all the takeaways that I had from South Carolina's depth chart that was released on Monday. And with that being said, that does it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are your thoughts about how South Carolina could potentially stop Drake Maye? Do you agree with the plan that I sort of laid out? Or do you think that there's something that I missed that should have been included? And also, what were your main takeaways from this depth chart that was dropped yesterday afternoon? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watched today's show on YouTube, or shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @A_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. Once again, thank y'all so much as always for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.